The roses at Ember Cottage were the finest in 3 counties, and no one who had seen Harriet Voss tend them would have been surprised. She knelt in the early morning with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair bound in a plain cotton wrap, cutting back the spent blooms from the climber that had taken the south wall in the 4 months since she had arrived. The cottage was small, and the garden was not, which suited her exactly. She had brought 3 things with her from Ashford Hall: her mother's pruning shears, a leather-bound ledger she had filled cover to cover, and the habit of waking before the house needed her. There was no house to need her now, that was the point. The village of Ember Crossing did not know what to make of her at first. She had arrived on a hired cart with 2 trunks and a hat box, and had paid the first 6 months of the cottage's lease in banknotes from a worn envelope, which Mrs. Farrow at the letting office had folded away without comment. She was neither widow nor maiden aunt in any recognisable configuration. She was simply a woman of 27 who had left a position and intended to stay left. Within a fortnight, the village had stopped speculating and started offering her cuttings, which Harriet understood to be the higher form of local acceptance. She did not think about Ashford Hall often, or she thought about it in the way one thinks about a room one has finally been allowed to leave, with a complicated gratitude that had very little warmth in it. She thought about the accounts more than about the man, and the accounts were at least resolved. She had settled the last of the disputed creditor ledgers before she left, had written 3 pages of notes for whoever came after her, and had folded them with the estate keys into an envelope addressed to Mr. Granger, the solicitor, and placed them on the steward's desk at 6 in the morning before the household woke. She had not left a letter for the Duke of Ashford. There had not seemed to be anything to say that the accounts did not already say better. The pruning shears clicked, and a stem fell. She moved to the next one. She had managed Ashford Hall's household and lower estate accounts for 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She knew the precise figure because she had written it in the final ledger entry, not for sentiment, but because any accounting required a proper closing date. The Duke had been absent for most of that time, in London for the season, at his club, at various country houses. He had returned twice, stayed a fortnight each time, reviewed nothing, and thanked no one. The estate had run because Harriet had made it run. The tenant agreements, the wool merchant contracts, the repairs to the South Granary, the negotiation with the Halcott Canal Company over the disputed drainage. All of it had been her. She had not expected recognition. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like welcome. But she had expected, in the end, to stay. It was the lease matter that had finished it. A neighbouring estate, Dereham Park, had approached Ashford Hall's solicitor about a long-standing boundary lease on 23 acres of river meadow, and Harriet had spent 6 weeks reviewing the original documents from 1803, cross-referencing them against the updated county maps, and drafting a counter-proposal that would have secured the Duke's interests and recovered approximately £400 annually in grazing revenue. She had presented it to Mr. Granger in writing, with every relevant document attached. Mr. Granger had taken it to London. When the Duke had returned and accepted Dereham Park's original, inferior offer without amendment, Harriet had gone very still at her desk and looked at the window for a long moment. She was not going to step aside for anyone's convenience, but she was also not going to spend another year building things that would be handed away before the ink dried. She had given her notice properly, in the correct form, with the standard 30-day period observed. She had finished her work, and then she had gone. The rose had perhaps 12 more cuts in it before the morning light shifted, and she needed to put the shears down. She counted them as she worked, not to pass the time, but because she had always counted. It was the particular habit of a woman who had discovered early that the world went easier when everything in it was precisely measured. The sound came from the lane at 8:30, which she identified by the quality of the light and the position of the shadow along the east wall. Wheels on the track, not a farm cart, which would have been slower and lower, A private carriage. She did not look up immediately. Private carriages sometimes passed through Ember Crossing on their way to the market town. This one stopped at her gate. She looked up then. The man standing at the gate was tall, dark-coated, and very precisely dressed for a lane in a village that contained no one who would appreciate the distinction. He had removed his hat and was holding it with both hands, which she had never seen him do at Ashford Hall. His face was exactly as she remembered it, contained, watchful, carrying the kind of stillness that a person acquires not from peace, but from long practice in concealment. Harriet straightened her spine, set the pruning shears on the low wall, and did not move toward the gate. "Your Grace," she said. The Duke of Ashford looked at her across the gate, at her garden gloves and her rolled sleeves and the cotton wrap in her hair, and said, "You left a wrong figure in the South Granary column of the November accounts." She had been away from Ashford Hall for 1 year, 2 months, and 4 days. It was not the opening she had expected, but it was, she reflected, entirely characteristic. "The figure is not wrong," she said. "It accounts for the 23 acres of river meadow I told Mr. Granger you were giving away." She returned to the roses. Ashford Hall had found Harriet Voss in the spring of the year she turned 23, which was 3 years after her father died and 2 years after her uncle had arrived to manage the estate, and had discovered that the estate was largely managing itself. Her father, Edmund Voss, had been a gentleman farmer in the modest Lincolnshire style, respectable enough, educated, with a property that required consistent attention and modest ambitions that were largely satisfied. He had also been a man who believed, practically and without sentiment, that his daughter should understand how things actually worked. When Harriet was 12, he had begun teaching her the accounts. When she was 15, she was keeping them. When she was 18 and her mother was 2 years dead, she was managing the household, the farm correspondence, and the quarterly payments to the 3 creditors who held notes on a drainage project her father had undertaken with somewhat more confidence than the soil warranted. She did not resent the work. She had genuinely enjoyed it. The clean satisfaction of a column that balanced, the specific pleasure of a tenant agreement that was fair to both parties and would hold for 7 years without dispute. What she had occasionally resented was the invisibility of it, the way the work simply disappeared into the ordinary functioning of the property, so that to all appearances, nothing was happening, and everything was running smoothly, which was exactly what invisible skilled labour looked like from the outside. Her father had seen it. In the last year of his life, when the illness had kept him to his chair, and she had managed without him, he had watched her negotiate with a wool merchant by letter, 3 exchanges, a final figure that recovered 15% over the original offer, and had said, with great precision, "You have a better mind for this than I have, Harriet. I want you to know that I know it." He had died 6 weeks later, and she had closed his estate accounts and paid his debts, and then sat for one long evening with nothing particular to do, which felt more disorienting than anything else that had happened. Her uncle, Charles Voss, arrived with a manner that strongly suggested he had expected to find chaos and was slightly disappointed to find order. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had already built his own world in his own way and found it structurally impractical to adjust it to include his niece. He reviewed the accounts with the expression of a man who would have preferred to find them in worse condition. He paid the remaining creditors. He let the property to a neighbouring farmer and moved Harriet to his house in Grantham, where she became, by degrees and without formal arrangement, the person who managed the household accounts, supervised the cook's quarterly orders, corresponded with the solicitor, and kept track of the school fees for her 2 younger cousins in a way that prevented her uncle from ever having to think about them. She was paid, technically, £28 annually, which was the going rate for a companion, and considerably less than the going rate for a household manager, which was what she actually was. She knew this because she had reviewed the household expense books and cross-referenced them against the rates listed in a domestic employment register she had borrowed from the lending library. The figure was not an accident. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She did not argue the point. She kept the books. She kept 2 separate ledgers, the official one, which her uncle reviewed quarterly, and a private one, in which she tracked everything she had saved him by anticipating problems before they became crises. In her first full year in Grantham, she had renegotiated the coal merchant's contract and recovered £11. She had identified that the cook's supplier was inflating the beef prices by a consistent 3 farthings per pound across a quarterly order, not enough to notice without looking, more than enough to matter across 12 months, and had corrected it. She had drafted a letter to the school in Nottingham that had resulted in a reduction in her cousin's boarding fees in exchange for a 3-year prepayment commitment, saving the household £42 over the term. None of this appeared in any document that bore her name. The savings appeared as improvements in the household accounts. The improvements appeared, to her uncle, as evidence that things were running smoothly. But a retired estate advisor, named Mr. Clifton, who had been a friend of her father's and occasionally came to dinner, had noticed. He was a quiet man of 60 or so, silver-haired and unhurried, who had managed 3 great estates in a career that had largely made him invisible, as such careers tended to do. He sat beside her once at dinner and said, under the cover of a general table conversation, "Your uncle's household expenses have decreased by 9% in 2 years. Miss Voss, that is not an accident." Harriet had looked at him steadily and said, "No." "Are you well compensated?" he had asked, with the particular directness of a man who already knew the answer. "I am compensated," she had said. He had nodded once, slowly, in the manner of a man filing something away. 3 months later, she had received a letter from Mr. Clifton explaining that a position had become available. Not the official steward's role, which required a man, but the role of household secretary and accounts supervisor at Ashford Hall in Northamptonshire, which the current Duke had apparently agreed to fill, despite some resistance from his father, the former Duke, who was still alive and extremely opinionated. The salary was £60 annually. The work would be real. She could start in April. She had carried the letter to her uncle's study and placed it on his desk. She had told him the terms. She had waited for his response with her hands quiet at her sides. He had said, after a pause that was slightly too long, "You've been content here." "I have been useful here," Harriet had said. "Those are different things." She had gone in April. The Duke of Ashford had not been present when she arrived. He was in London, where he apparently spent most of his time during the season. The estate was managed in his absence by Mr. Granger, the solicitor, and a rotating series of understewards who were competent in the way that all understewards were competent, adequately, within the parameters of tasks they had been trained for, and without any particular appetite for the tasks that fell between the parameters. She had spent the first 2 weeks simply reading. Every ledger, every contract, every tenant agreement, every outstanding note. She read the drainage dispute with the Halcock Canal Company, which had been unresolved for 3 years and was currently costing the estate an annual fee of £60 for access rights that should have been free under the original 1798 easement. She found the original easement document in the 3rd drawer of the steward's filing cabinet, behind a collection of receipts from 1817. She read it carefully. She made notes. She also met Mrs. Aldgate, the housekeeper, who had welcomed her on the first morning with a cup of tea and the look of a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone to do her job properly. Mrs. Aldgate was 61, had worked at Ashford Hall for 27 years, and possessed a kind of calm authority that the household moved around like water around a stone. She showed Harriet the pantry stores, the linen records, and the room that had been her mother's sitting room, a small morning room off the east corridor that had been closed for 14 years since the Duchess died. "I keep it clean," Mrs. Aldgate said, in a tone that required no explanation. "His Grace doesn't come in, but I keep it clean." Harriet had stood in the doorway and looked at the room, at the small writing desk, the curtains taken in at the hem to account for some settling in the floor, the faint marks on the windowsill where someone had rested their hands repeatedly over many years and had said nothing. She had gone back to her own desk and her own work, and had put the room away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered and didn't yet need acting on. The Duke of Ashford had arrived in August, 7 weeks after she had, on a Tuesday afternoon that was notable for its heat. She had known he was coming because Mrs. Aldgate had told her on Monday, and she had known what to expect because she had by then read his household correspondence and his account history and had a reasonable sense of his character from the documentary record he had left behind him. He had walked through the front hall, through the drawing room, and directly into the estate office without removing his coat, and had found Harriet at the steward's desk with the Halcott Canal Company correspondence spread across it in a configuration that made sense only if you had read all of it. He had looked at the documents. He had looked at her. He had said, "What is this?" "The canal easement dispute," she had said. "The 1798 document establishes your right to free access at the eastern drainage point. The company has been charging a fee without legal basis for 3 years. I have drafted a letter to their solicitor. If you review it and sign it, the fee should be recovered within 6 months and the annual charge eliminated." He had stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read. Not displeasure, not surprise exactly, but something more like a man recalibrating a measurement he had already taken. He had said, "You've been here 7 weeks." "Yes, Your Grace." He had read the letter. He had signed it. He had left the room without further comment. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. She had picked up her pen and returned to the next item on the list. The Duke of Ashford came back to Ember Crossing 4 days after his first visit, then 3 days after that. By the 3rd week, his carriage was arriving on Tuesdays and Thursdays, with a regularity that Ember Crossing had noted and was beginning to form opinions about. Harriet let him in at the gate on the 4th visit and put the kettle on, which was the practical response to a man who had now driven 40 miles in each direction on 2 separate occasions, without ever explaining why. He sat at her small kitchen table with his hat on his knee and looked at the ledger she had left open there, not her professional ledger, but a gardening record, in which she tracked the blooming dates, the pruning schedules, and the performance of every variety in the half-acre she had been cultivating since April. "You're keeping accounts of the roses," he said. "I keep accounts of everything," she said. "I know," he said, and it was quiet and without ornament, and she set the tea things down, with more care than the action required. She had not expected him to look the way he looked. She had expected the version of him she remembered from the estate, competent in the social shell, efficient in the narrow window of attention he had directed at her work, fundamentally elsewhere. What she had not expected was the man who arrived at her gate with his hat in both hands, who sat at her table and looked at her gardening ledger with what could only be described as studious attention, and who had arrived, apparently, without knowing exactly what to say. She had managed harder things than a duke who didn't know what to say. "You didn't read the counter-proposal," she said, sitting down across from him. "On the Dereham Park lease, the one I gave Mr. Granger." Granger summarised it, he said. Granger's summary was 2 paragraphs, she said. The counter-proposal was 11 pages, with supporting documentation. You accepted an offer that costs you £400 annually when you could have recovered it. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at his hat. "I was in London when Granger sent it," he said. "There were other matters. I should have read it." "Yes," she said. He looked up then, and there was something in the look that was not quite the measuring attention she remembered from their first meeting, and not quite the containment he wore the rest of the time. It was something older and less practiced. A man looking at a loss he had decided to stop pretending wasn't one. "I should have read a great many things," he said, "more carefully than I did." Harriet poured the tea and did not say anything. The acknowledgement was real. It was also a year late, which was the kind of fact she kept track of. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue, but she did not send him away. What Harriet did not know, and would not know until considerably later, was that the Duke of Ashford had spent the 12 months between her departure and his arrival at her gate in a state of activity that was, by his own standards, approaching something like agitation. He had returned to Ashford Hall in late October of the previous year, 4 weeks after her departure, expecting to find the estate running in the accustomed fashion. He had found the estate running flawlessly, every account settled, every contract current, every outstanding negotiation resolved or documented, and had found, in the envelope on the steward's desk, 3 pages of notes written in Harriet's precise hand that told him exactly what needed attention in the coming quarter, who to speak to at the Halcott Canal Company to ensure the recovered easement was properly recorded, and the specific language in the Dereham Park lease that he had agreed to without understanding that it was inferior. He had read those pages 3 times. He had then called Mr. Granger to Ashford Hall and asked him, with considerable restraint, why he had summarised an 11-page counter-proposal in 2 paragraphs. Granger had been defensive in the way of men who knew they had been careless. Ashford had let him be defensive and then had asked for the original counter-proposal. He had read all 11 pages. He had then reviewed the Dereham Park lease as signed. He had sat with that comparison for a long time, at the desk in the estate office, where Harriet had sat for 4 years and 3 months, and had felt something that he identified, after some resistance, as the specific weight of a mistake that had already cost him something. He had hired an inquiry agent to confirm her current address, not because he intended to act on it immediately, but because he was precise about this, even in his own private reckoning, not going to let the possibility of acting on it become unavailable. The agent had reported back within a fortnight. Ember Cottage, the village of Ember Crossing, Derbyshire, lease paid through the following April. He had done nothing with this information for 9 months. What he had done during those 9 months was more useful. He had read every document that Harriet had generated during her 4 years at Ashford Hall, not reviewed, read, the wool merchant contracts with her marginal annotations, the canal company correspondence, the tenant agreements she had drafted or revised, which he counted and found to be 29 of the 37 currently in force, the South Granary accounts, which were the basis for the alleged discrepancy that he had used as his opening at her gate, and which he had, by now, fully understood were not wrong. The figure she had entered was exactly correct. The column it sat in was labelled with a specificity that was both accurate and, he now recognised, quietly indicting. He had also found, in the back of the morning room, the room that had been his mother's, that he had not entered in 14 years, a small piece of paper that had no business being there. It was a note in Harriet's handwriting, dated to the previous spring, which said only, "The curtains have been taken in at the hem. The window shows light well in the afternoon. I did not touch anything." He had sat with that piece of paper for a considerable time. His mother had died when he was 19, of a fever that moved too fast for anything to be done about it. She had been the person in his life who had, with quiet consistency, looked at the thing he was actually doing, rather than the thing she expected him to do. He had understood, from an early age, that this quality was rare. He had understood, from the months of reading, that Harriet Voss had possessed it in full. He had understood, from the note about the curtains, that she had possessed it in relation to things that were not her responsibility, and from which she had expected nothing. He had driven to Ember Crossing on a Tuesday morning in April, not because he had a plan, but because 9 months was already too long. He had looked across her gate at her rolled sleeves, and her cotton-wrapped hair, and her rose-stained pruning gloves, and had felt, with the specific clarity of a thing finally admitted, that the estate was not the only thing he had failed to read carefully enough. The roses continued to improve through May and into June. and so did Ashford's visits. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and, after a fortnight, occasionally on Saturdays, when the drive from the hall allowed it. He developed the habit of arriving and finding his own way to wherever Harriet was. The garden, the small parlour where she kept her correspondence, the kitchen table where she was sometimes working through a particularly complicated passage in the household guide she had begun writing in the winter, a guide to estate account management that she had intended for her own reference and had gradually expanded because she found, upon examination, that no such document existed in adequate form. They talked about the Halcott Canal settlement, which had been properly recorded and was saving the estate £60 annually as of March. They talked about the Derham Park lease, which Ashford had renegotiated in the spring, not to the full recovery figure from Harriet's original counter-proposal, since the window for that had narrowed, but to within £90 of it, which he reported without self-congratulation, and she acknowledged without excessive generosity. They talked about the morning room, carefully, once, in a conversation that was brief and factual, and that required, from both of them, a kind of precision that had nothing to do with accounts. His mother had loved music. This was known. What was not widely known, what he had not told anyone, including his father, who would have used it carelessly, was that the morning room contained, in the small writing desk, a composition she had been working on in the last year of her life, unfinished. 12 pages of notation, the final page trailing off in the middle of a phrase, as though she had meant to return to it the following day. He had told Harriet about it in the kitchen, on a Thursday in May, without quite planning to. She had listened without interjecting, which was its own quality. She had then said, with the particular stillness she used for things that mattered, "Have you looked at it recently?" "No," he said. "The pages may be readable," she said. "I can help you assess them if you like." A pause. "Music is not my primary competence, but I read well." He had pressed one hand briefly against the table, and then lifted it. "It would require going into the room," he said. "Yes," she said. He had looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was not measurement, not the estimating attention she had first seen at his arrival, but something that was trying to say something it had not yet found the form for. "Next week," he said. She nodded and returned to her composition. He did not say anything. He simply stayed at the table until the light changed, and then he rose and took his hat and was gone. There was also, during this period, the matter of Mr. Beaumont. Mr. Thomas Beaumont was a solicitor from the county town who had twice called at Ember Cottage on behalf of a local property owner interested in retaining Harriet's estate management knowledge in a formal consulting capacity. The first visit she had declined politely. The second visit Ashford had arrived in the lane during and had remained outside the gate, standing in a way that was entirely calm and had nothing about it that was aggressive, simply very present, until the solicitor had completed his business and left. She had looked at him through the window and then come to the door. "You needn't have stood there," she said. "I arrived and you were engaged," he said. "I waited." "You waited with the particular quality of a man who did not intend to be invisible," she said. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was not quite the containment she was used to, a slight fracture in the surface of it, like a well-built bridge settling under new weight. "Did you accept his offer?" he asked. "No," she said. The fracture eased. He came through the gate. Lady Catherine Morwell arrived at Ashford Hall the second week of June, on a visit arranged through the Duke's father, the Dowager Duke, whose formal title was largely ceremonial, but whose opinions were structural. Lady Catherine was 24, fair, perfectly composed, the granddaughter of an earl, and had been considered the obvious match for Ashford for approximately 4 years by everyone in the relevant social circle, except Ashford himself, who had been polite about the matter without ever advancing it. The Dowager Duke wrote a letter to Ashford that arrived the same week, which Ashford read once at his desk and then folded with more precision than the action required. The letter outlined, in his father's characteristic register of principled disappointment, the several structural reasons why the match with Lady Catherine was appropriate, and the several equally structural reasons why Ashford's Tuesday and Thursday drives to Derbyshire represented a disruption of something that had been built over several generations and ought not to be pulled loose by sentiment. Ashford replied by return post. The letter was very short. It said, "I have read your letter. I understand your concerns. I am going to Ember Crossing on Tuesday." The Dowager Duke appeared at Ashford Hall 2 days later, which was itself a form of argumentation. He was a tall man, older now, with the same contained quality his son had, and none of his son's capacity for silence. He had strongly held views delivered in the register of historical inevitability, and he had the specific frustration of a man who was accustomed to being the last word on a subject, finding that his son had decided, at 31, to stop hearing him as the last word. They met in the library. She managed accounts, the Dowager Duke said, for wages. She managed this estate, Ashford said, for 4 years, to a standard that has not been matched before or since. That is a factual statement, not a sentiment. There is a difference, his father said, between competence and suitability. I am aware, Ashford said. I am choosing to weight them differently than you would. Lady Catherine. Lady Catherine is a capable and estimable woman, Ashford said, who deserves a man who drives to see her of his own inclination. I am not that man. The silence between them was long. You are proposing to marry your secretary, the Dowager Duke said. I am proposing to ask Miss Voss if she will have me, Ashford said, with the particular evenness of a man who had made his decision and intended to hold it. Those are different things. His father left the following morning, without any additional discussion. It was not agreement. It was the specific silence of a man who had recognized that the argument was over and had not yet decided what to do with that recognition. At Ember Cottage, Harriet had her own opposition to navigate, which arrived in the form of Mrs. Pendleton, the wife of the largest landholder in the Ember Crossing area, who called on a Wednesday with a basket of preserves and an agenda. Mrs. Pendleton was warm, well-intentioned, and completely transparent. I hope, Mrs. Pendleton said, over the preserves, that you are not allowing yourself to develop expectations where the Duke is concerned. Harriet looked at her. I say this, Mrs. Pendleton continued, as someone who only wishes your welfare. I appreciate your concern, Harriet said. I have no expectations. He visits twice weekly, Mrs. Pendleton said. The village has noticed. The village notices everything, Harriet said, without heat, including the state of my roses, which they have opinions about. It does not follow that their observations determine outcomes. Mrs. Pendleton folded her hands. A man in his position does not marry. I am aware of what men in his position do and do not do, Harriet said, with precision and without hardness. I have managed the accounts for one of their estates. I have a thorough professional understanding of the structural expectations. I am not operating under any illusions, and I do not need protection from the reality of my own situation. Mrs. Pendleton looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was recalibrating. You are very composed, she said. I have been managing creditors and landlords for 7 years, Harriet said. I find I am composed about most things. Mrs. Pendleton left her preserves and went home, and Harriet put the jar in the kitchen and returned to her household guide, and pressed one hand briefly against the cover before opening it. She had, in point of fact, no expectations. What she had was the precise measurement of what she felt, which was considerable, and a thorough professional understanding of why nothing about it was straightforward, and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had decided, years ago, that she was not going to become less than she was in order to make someone else's structural preferences more convenient. She had also the manuscript, which he had brought to her that Tuesday in late May, 12 pages of his mother's composition in a leather folder, handled with the careful impersonality of a man who had packed the feeling away somewhere he could not entirely locate. She had read it thoroughly. She had said, after a long pause, "It is not finished." "No," he said. "But the shape is there," she said. "The final phrase is, 'It was going somewhere specific. I can see the intention.'" She looked at the last page, at the trailing notation. It would require someone who knew the form to complete it, not to change it, to follow where it was going. "You said music was not your primary competence," he said. "It is not," she said. "But I can read the intention. The structure is there. It is asking to be followed, not invented." He had looked at the pages in her hands for a long moment. Then he had said, quietly, "There is a pianoforte in the morning room. She played it every morning before anyone else woke." Harriet had nodded slowly. She set the pages down with care, like a document she intended to return to, and said, "Then it should be played there, when you are ready." He had nodded. He had taken the pages. He had gone to his carriage. He had come back on Thursday with the folder under his arm and driven not to Ember Cottage, but directly to Ashford Hall, where he had opened the morning room for the first time in 14 years and sat in the chair beside the window and read the 12 pages again. He did not feel ready. He had come anyway. The reckoning came in July, and it came in the form of the Northamptonshire Agricultural and Estate Society's quarterly meeting, held at Malvern House, under the chairmanship of Lord Denison, who was one of the larger landholders in the county, and a man whose opinions on estate management carried the particular weight of someone who had never personally managed an estate, but had strong views about who should. The meeting had been called, ostensibly, to address a proposed revision to the standard tenant agreement framework in use across 17 estates in the county. The revision had been circulating for 6 weeks. Harriet had written it. She had written it, or rather she had written the original, a thorough revision of the standard framework that addressed 3 structural inadequacies in the 1819 template, including a clause on drainage responsibility that had been the source of disputes on at least 4 estates, including Ashford Hall, in the previous 5 years. She had drafted it in her first winter at Ember Cottage and had sent it, through Mr. Clifton, to the Society's secretary as an analytical submission, without expectation of it going anywhere. It had gone, apparently, somewhere. What she had not anticipated was Lord Denison's response, which had been to circulate the document with a covering letter, attributing it to a committee of estate advisors, and inviting the Society's membership to debate it at the July meeting. Her name appeared nowhere in the circulation. The analytical submission had been absorbed into institutional process and rendered anonymous, which was not a surprise but was also not, upon reflection, something she was inclined to accept quietly. She had written to Mr. Clifton, who had written to the Society's secretary, who had sent back a reply of 2.5 sentences indicating that the document's provenance was a matter of internal record and would be acknowledged at the appropriate time. It was Ashford who told her about the meeting. He had received the circular and had read it, and had come to Ember Cottage on the Thursday with the document in his hand, and had put it on the table in front of her without preamble. She had read it. She had read the covering letter. She had read the attribution. She had been still for a long moment. Then she had picked up the document, folded it precisely, and set it beside her correspondence tray. "You wrote this," he said. It was not a question. "The original," she said. "The covering letter represents it as collective work, which is an efficient erasure. The session is open to submission of written evidence?" "It is," he said. "Then I will prepare a submission," she said, "with the original draft, the dates, and the relevant correspondence. If the chair will permit the document to be read into the record, the attribution will be accurate." He had looked at her with the particular quality of a man who was seeing something he had already begun to understand, and was now simply watching arrive. "The chair is Lord Denison," he said. "He is unlikely to permit it willingly. Then it will need to be introduced through a member present," she said. Do you have standing to introduce evidence at the session? I do, he said. She had looked at him then, directly, without the professional distance she had learned to keep between them, for one precise second. I am not asking you to do it on my behalf, she said. I am asking if the mechanism exists. It exists, he said, and I intend to use it. She nodded once. She picked up her pen. There were 6 days to the meeting, and she had work to do. The Northamptonshire Agricultural and Estate Society met at Malvern House on the 3rd Tuesday of July, in the long east hall that smelled of old wood and the particular density of rooms that had been used for important gatherings for a long time. 41 members were present or represented, ranging from large estate owners to solicitors to the county's 2 leading wool merchants, both of whom had a significant financial interest in the tenant agreement framework under discussion. Harriet arrived not as a member. She was not, of course, a member, but as a guest of Lord Ashford, who had written ahead to indicate he would be bringing a specialist on the analytical document and requesting floor time in the evidence session. Lord Denison had written back with the controlled hospitality of a man who could not refuse without appearing unreasonable, and intended to make the experience sufficiently uncomfortable that she would not do it again. She wore a grey dress she had already worn twice. She brought the leather document folder. The meeting began with the usual business, which she tracked without appearing to track it, and moved to the tenant agreement revision after 40 minutes. Lord Denison introduced it with the covering letter language, collective work, committee derived, the anonymous quality of things that are meant to be absorbed without origin. She sat very still. Ashford, from his seat, rose when Denison paused, and said, without raising his voice, "My lord, I believe the society would benefit from hearing from the document's author, with the chair's permission." Denison looked at him. "The authorship is a matter of committee record." "With respect," Ashford said, "I have the original draft, dated and signed, in Miss Voss's hand, along with the original submission letter, the Secretary's acknowledgement receipt, and the communication that accompanied the revision's circulation. If the chair would permit, I would ask Miss Voss to speak to the document's origins and to the analytical framework she employed." There was the pause that rooms produce when something has just been said that cannot be unsaid. Harriet rose. She brought the folder to the front. She opened it on the table, with the specific care of a woman who had handled important documents long enough to know exactly how they should be handled. "The document before you," she said, to the 41 people in the room, with the quiet steadiness of a woman who had been managing creditors since she was 18, and found this, in comparison, straightforward, was drafted by me during the winter of 1820, based on 4 years of estate account management at Ashford Hall and additional analysis of records from 6 other Northamptonshire properties, conducted with the cooperation of their respective solicitors. I will now describe the analytical basis for each of the 3 framework revisions, beginning with the Drainage Responsibility Clause, which has been the basis for 6 documented disputes in this county in the past decade. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not argue. She did not plead. She presented the original documents, the supporting analysis, the 6 disputed cases, the projected savings under the revised framework, the specific language of each change, and the reasoning behind it. The room did not respond immediately. There was a long moment in which no one moved, in which the particular stillness of a room that has been given more information than it expected settled over the assembled members. Then Mr. Hathaway, one of the wool merchants, who had a vested interest in clear drainage terms and the specific practicality of a man who cared about results rather than process, said, "The 6-year projection on recovered margin, can you break that by estate size?" "Yes," she said, and turned to the 4th page. Lord Denison spoke twice during the subsequent discussion, once to suggest that the original submission protocol had been followed correctly, which Harriet addressed by reading the Secretary's acknowledgement letter aloud, and once to observe that the document's analytical framework was impressive, but that questions of formal attribution were complex, which Mr. Clifton, who was present as an observer, addressed from the floor by producing a copy of the original submission with Harriet's name on it. The room did not convert. Rooms do not convert. But it changed, in the specific way that rooms change when the evidence has been made undeniable. A shift in the weight of things, a recalibration of where the authority in the room actually sat. At the end of the evidence session, Ashford rose from his seat, moved to the front of the room, and stood beside her. "The record of this society," he said, clearly and without drama, "should reflect that the revision to the tenant agreement framework was authored by Miss Harriet Voss, estate management specialist, and submitted under her name to this society in January of this year. I recommend that the record be corrected accordingly." He paused. "I also intend to adopt the revised framework in full at Ashford Hall, effective this quarter." He turned to her then, in front of the 41 members, and took her hand and kissed it. Not the gloved hand, but the bare one, which she had extended without quite realizing she was doing it, and which he held for a moment before releasing. The room understood what that meant before it could articulate it. Lord Denison was quiet, not converted and not collapsed, but unable to deny what the room had just witnessed. He moved, after a pause, to accept the corrected attribution into the record, which he did with the expression of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at a number he would have preferred to avoid. Harriet set the pages back in the folder with careful hands. She pressed them closed. She had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work. The Dowager Duke came to Ember Cottage in August. Harriet had not expected him. She had been in the garden, tying back a climbing rose that had taken the arch faster than she had anticipated, when his carriage came down the lane, smaller than Ashford's, and a different colour, but the crest on the door was unmistakable. She untied her garden gloves, set them on the wall, and went to the gate. He was older than she had imagined, thinner through the face, with the carried quality of a man who had been managing the weight of a dukedom for decades and had not put it down easily. He stood at her gate with his hat on, which was a different form of arrival than his son's. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "Will you come in?" He did. He sat at the kitchen table, which she suspected he had not sat at in a kitchen in a very long time, and looked at the household guide open on the table, and the correspondence, and the ledger she kept for the garden. "My son intends to ask you to marry him," he said. "I am aware," she said. "You have not yet been asked." "No." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ledger. "That is your garden," he said. "Yes. And this," he said, touching the edge of the household guide, "is not a personal document. It is a professional one," she said. "A guide to estate account management. I intend to present it to the Society's library." He looked at her then, directly, without warmth but also without contempt, with the specific attention of a man who was conducting an honest assessment and was not entirely comfortable with where it was landing. "You are not," he said carefully, "what I would have chosen." "No," she said. "I am not what the structure would have chosen. I understand the distinction." He was quiet again, for longer. His hands were still on the table. He had the stillness his son had, but carried differently. Like armor that had been worn for so long, it had rusted into the shape of the man beneath it. "My son," he said, finally, "is not a man who acts without consideration. He has always been that way, even as a boy. Whatever he decides, he has thought on it thoroughly." "I believe that is true," she said. "What he has decided," he said, with the restraint of a man paying a debt he had not expected to owe, "is apparently that what you bring is worth the difficulty of the choice." He paused. "I have reviewed the Society's revised record. I saw the projection documents from the meeting." She did not say anything. "The drainage clause alone," he said, would have saved the Durham Park boundary dispute from going 2 years. He looked at the table. I would have seen that if I had been shown it. Yes, she said quietly. You would have. He rose. He put his hat on. He said, at the door, without turning, I am not giving you my blessing. You should understand that. I have expressed a view, and I will not recant it publicly. A pause. I will not obstruct it either. Harriet nodded. I understand, she said. I am not asking for your blessing. I am asking only that you judge what you actually see. He left without responding to that, which was the most honest response available to him. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, with her hand pressed flat against the table, and then she went back to the roses. Ashford came on a Thursday in late August, which was the week after the Society had formally adopted the revised tenant framework and entered the corrected attribution into their permanent record, and 2 days after Mr. Clifton had written to tell Harriet that 3 neighbouring estates had already requested copies of the Household Guide's first section, which she had presented to the library in June. He arrived at 10 in the morning and found her in the garden. He came through the gate without stopping at it and crossed the grass to where she was working and stood for a moment looking at the south wall, which had filled in entirely since April, a climber in full late summer bloom, cream-coloured and vigorous, covering the stonework from ground to roofline. You built this in a year, he said. I planted it in April, she said. The wall faces south. The conditions were favourable. She kept her hands at work on the cutting she was tying. A wall that faces south retains heat. The rose does the rest. He was quiet for a moment. Harriet, he said. It was the first time he had used her name, and she went still with the shears in her hand. I have been to my father, he said, and to Mr. Granger, and to the estate solicitor, and to the Society's chair, and I have made arrangements that I will explain to you in detail if you want to know them. I intend to be transparent about the particulars. He paused. But I want to say something first that has nothing to do with arrangements. She turned to face him. He was not wearing his hat. He had removed his coat at the gate, she noticed. It was over the fence post, the way it might be in a place he had been coming long enough to feel was partially his. I did not read carefully enough, he said. Not the counter-proposal, not the years before it. I was somewhere that was not Ashford Hall, and the hall ran because you made it run, and I accepted that as the way of things without looking at what made it true. He looked at her steadily. I am not offering you an apology in place of something real. I am telling you that I have looked now, and I have kept looking, and what I see is, I see someone I cannot account for by any ordinary measure. She waited. I am asking you to marry me, he said, not because it resolves a difficulty, or serves the estate, or satisfies any requirement my position imposes, but because you are the person I drive 40 miles to argue with about account ledgers, and then stay 3 hours past the point where I have anything useful left to say. Because you went into a room that no one had gone into in 14 years, and left a note that asked for nothing. Because I would like to spend the rest of my life in proximity to the specific way you think, and I would like to do that honestly and properly and in full view of anyone who wants to have opinions about it. Harriet set the shears down on the low wall. She looked at the south wall of the cottage, at the roses she had planted and tended and counted and recorded, which had done exactly what she had known they would do, given sufficient sun and time and the right kind of attention. She thought about it completely. It took perhaps 40 seconds, which was less time than she would normally give a significant decision, but she recognized, been conducting the analysis for some time already. Yes, she said, with the understanding that I will continue my own work, and that I intend to present the Household Guide to the National Agricultural Registry, and that the morning room should be opened and used. Yes, he said, to all 3. Then yes, she said. He crossed the last 3 feet of garden between them and took her hand, not her gloved hand, but the bare one she had not thought to cover, and held it, and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. They were married in October, in Northamptonshire, in the church at Ember Crossing, that smelled of old wood and late summer warmth, and had a congregation that consisted of Mrs. Aldgate and Mr. Clifton, and the Farrow family from the letting office, and a peer friend named Miss Anna Colley, who had become Harriet's closest correspondent since the society meeting, and who sat in the front pew with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular event and intended to enjoy it properly. The Dowager Duke attended. He sat at the back. He did not speak to Harriet, but as she came down the aisle on Mr. Clifton's arm, she saw him watching with the expression of a man who had decided to see what was actually in front of him, and she met his eyes for a moment and then looked ahead. Miss Colley threw rice with more enthusiasm than the occasion required, and told Harriet afterward, in the small yard outside the church, that the account of the society meeting had been the most satisfying thing she had heard in 7 years, and that she intended to read the household guide front to back and recommend it to everyone she knew. "You should recommend it to your brother's estate manager," Harriet said. "Section 4 is the most practically useful." "I intend to," Miss Colley said, with the directness of a woman who never said things she didn't mean. Mrs. Aldgate welcomed Harriet back to Ashford Hall with a cup of tea and the expression of someone for whom no words were necessary, which was its own form of ceremony. The morning room was opened in November. Ashford had the pianoforte tuned, a task that required the instrument specialist from Northampton, who arrived with the respectful seriousness of a craftsman, presented with something that had been waiting a long time. The room was already clean. Harriet had known it would be. She sat at the instrument one evening in the second week of November, with the 12 pages of the Duchess's composition on the stand before her, and played what was there. Not the finished thing. It was not finished. But she played the shape of it, the intention, the direction, the phrase it was working toward. When she reached the final page, the trailing notation, she did not stop. She followed the line where it was going. She was not inventing. She was reading, very carefully, what had already been said, and following it to where it had wanted to arrive. The composition lasted 12 minutes. She played it twice. Ashford stood in the doorway both times, which she was aware of from the quality of the stillness behind her. She did not turn. She played it through to the end. When she finished the second time and lifted her hands from the keys, he was very quiet for a long moment. "That last section," he said. "That was already there," she said. "It was in the phrase on the final page. I only followed it." He came into the room properly then, which was, she knew, the first time he had done so in 14 years. He sat in the chair by the window, the chair that bore the faint marks of long habitual use, and looked at the curtains and the morning light the room held so well. Harriet put the pages back into the folder with careful hands and set them beside the instrument where they would be easy to find. She straightened his cravat, which she had noticed was crooked for the last 40 minutes. He looked at her. She returned to her chair at the writing desk, where she was working through the final section of the household guide, the one on long-term creditor management and estate succession planning, which she intended to have complete before the new year. They were quiet for a good while in that way, her writing, him at the window, the late morning light very steady across the room. Their son was born in August of the following year, and named Edmund, for her father, which was Ashford's suggestion and her immediate agreement. He had her dark hair and Ashford's grey eyes, and his grandfather's expression of contained assessment, which he deployed from approximately the 4th week of life, and which made Mrs. Aldgate say, the first time she saw it, "Well, that's the house accounted for." The household guide was presented to the National Agricultural Registry in the spring and entered into their permanent collection with Harriet's name on the title page and a foreword by Mr. Clifton, who had argued quietly and persistently with the registry's secretary until the attribution was properly recorded. Within 18 months, 11 estates across 4 counties had formally adopted the revised tenant framework. 3 had written to Ashford Hall to request a second edition. Harriet was at work on it. She worked at the desk in the estate office that had been her desk for 4 years, and was her desk again, more properly now, and kept 2 ledgers, the official one, which she reviewed with the estate steward weekly, and the private one, in which she tracked what the guide had recovered and what remained to be addressed, and what she intended to build next. The Dowager Duke came to Ashford Hall the following Christmas. He did not stay long. He held Edmund for approximately 2 minutes, which was a precise and deliberate act, and said nothing about it afterward. He did, before leaving, stop at the door of the estate office where Harriet was working and look at the desk, and at the ledgers, and at the letter she was drafting to the registry's secretary about the second edition. He said, "The third section, the one on creditor negotiation." A pause. "I have read it." She looked up. "It is correct," he said, with the restraint of a man paying a debt he had come around to accepting. "I would have done better with it at my own desk, earlier." He held his hat. "I am not saying it was an error not to have it." "I know," she said. He left. The carriage went down the lane in the winter light, and Harriet watched it from the window for a moment before returning to her letter. Edmund grew in the way that children grow when they are well attended to, with the specific energy of someone becoming themselves, all noise and investigation, and small disasters requiring management. He escaped the nursery with regularity from the age of 18 months, his preferred destination being the estate office, where he would pull himself along the desk leg and regard the ledger pages with the serious attention of someone who found them interesting and intended to return to them later. Ashford came to find him there one afternoon in the spring of Edmund's second year, a Tuesday, which was no longer a deliberate choice but simply a day, the way all their days had become simply days and good ones, and stood in the doorway, watching Harriet lift the boy back from the ledger with the ease of long practice, and said nothing. She knew he was watching. She had always known. She settled Edmund on her hip and looked at Ashford across the estate office, with the particular knowledge of a woman who had been seen, precisely and completely, by the one person in the world worth being seen by. Edmund reached toward the ledger on the desk with the expression of a man who would return to the matter. Later, Harriet told him, and returned to her work.